This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to China Global Television Network. This is The World Today. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi, and these are your top stories. At least 15 people killed in Sudan as demonstrators clash with security forces in Khartoum. The UN says the Islamic State is present in all Afghan provinces after the group claims responsibility for explosions in Kabul. And Germany on alert as COVID infections surge. Well, let's start in Sudan, where at least 15 people have been killed in anti-military protests. That's according to the Central Committee of Sudan Doctors. Reports say security forces opened fire on the protesters in the capital Khartoum and its twin city of Omdurman. Ahead of the Wednesday demonstrations, authorities closed 4 of the 10 bridges linking Khartoum with the cities of Bahri and Omdurman. The country has been experiencing a near total telecommunications blackout. The army chief, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, was sworn in last week as the head of a new ruling council he appointed to lead the country. The military takeover has drawn international criticism. Pro-democracy groups, though, have promised to continue protesting until the country returns to civilian rule.
The responsibility of the military is to maintain security. As for managing the state, it is for civilians, and the whole world is unanimous on that.
Well, CGTN's Musab Musin Ibrahim is in Khartoum and brings us the very latest from there.
We can see they go in a protest every 2 or 3 days. In a regular way, they're asking for their rights. So yesterday there was the big day for them. They went out, all of them, and unfortunately was not that big numbers like the previous protests and demonstrations. So the people asking for democracy and looking for a civil transmission government, and they were refusing what was being done by the general commander. Yesterday there was no internet connection. They cut the internet connections, and they cut the cell phone. We cannot call each other. We just can't receive call from outside Sudan. So the protesters started. They closed many bridges, but they opened one bridge, and we can say they stop people from going out. We see at this moment, so there's no any declaration about what's happening, and it's still the military and the forest using the power against the protests. They don't give them the right to protest in a peaceful way. So yesterday was unfortunately was a bad news for all the people from what's going on.
Now, the mass protests in Sudan come as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes his first visit to Africa. The Secretary of State has expressed concerns about democratic recession in Sudan, calling for the reinstatement of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. The Prime Minister is currently under house arrest in Khartoum.
And I'll say again about Prime Minister Hamdok, he is a source of legitimacy, and it's vital that the transition regain the legitimacy that it had before the civilian-led effort was derailed. But if the military puts this train back on its tracks and does what's necessary, I think the support that has been very strong from the international community can resume. That support has largely been suspended. People of Sudan have repeatedly made clear their aspirations for democracy, their aspirations for this transition to continue. So this is what they want. This is what the international community supports.
Right, let's turn to Afghanistan now. The UN envoy to the country says an affiliate of the militant Islamic State group has expanded. The affiliate now appears to be present in nearly all 34 provinces of the country.
ISIL-KP now seems to be present in nearly all provinces and increasingly active. The number of attacks has increased significantly from last year to this year. In 2021, 60. So far this year, 334 attacks attributed to ISKP, or in fact claimed by ISKP.
Well, the UN Special Representative says the Taliban's response to the expansion of the Islamic State affiliate is to rely heavily on extrajudicial detentions and killings of suspected fighters. She says the Taliban has been unable to stem the group's growth. Her comments came hours after the group claimed responsibility for 2 blasts. At least 1 person was killed and 6 others injured in a Shiite Muslim neighborhood. Zamaria Lai Abbasan has more from Kabul.
Kabul was rocked again by twin blasts in parts of Kabul in western areas in 13th and 3rd police districts. One of the attacks were confirmed by the Taliban Interior Ministry spokesperson Saeed Khusti, telling that 1 person is killed and 6 more injured. And the second explosion occurred in the 3rd police district of the western part of Kabul and the area, and there were also some reports by the local people and telling that at least 7 people were killed or injured in this attack, which is not yet confirmed by the government in Afghanistan. It's not only the attacks that are happening now or just in 3 months that the Taliban have taken control of the country, but before that, particularly since last 2 years, such kind of attacks are accelerating in the country. It's now many people were expecting that if the Taliban come to power or if there is any successful peace negotiation between the Afghan side and Taliban finally take their hands out of the war, there would be peace. But this is now a very shadowy space for the people of Afghanistan, and that's why there are much more concerns.
The United Nations says 10 of its local staff are still being held by security agencies in Ethiopia. The government says they're in custody for violating the recently imposed state of emergency and could be tried in a court of law once investigations are completed. A UN official on Monday said the government had freed 34 contract truck drivers supplying aid, but 36 are still detained. As CGTN's Girum Chala reports, the war in northern Ethiopia continues despite international efforts to end it.
The United Nations continued calling on Ethiopian authorities to release its employees who are still being detained over what Addis Ababa said is a breach of the state of emergency rules. Authorities at the Foreign Ministry told us the federal police has already released most UN workers arrested after the investigation was completed. The case for the rest of the detained suspects is being handled by the security team formed under the state of emergency. Ethiopian officials have reiterated anyone either belonging to the UN or AU who breaks the nation's law will be held accountable. On the other hand, war continues in the north, especially in the Amhara and Afar regions. We have received reports from the government source that TPLF forces are losing strategic locations to the ENDF.
An organized militia, the youth of Amhara known as Fanos, the Oromo Tribe Militia and the brave National Defense Force, as well as our Air Force, are repelling the blindly marching rebel force. They have now started a strong offensive, finishing their defensive works. Due to that, the town of Kemise is under a roundup by our forces. This is because people have responded to the government's call to defend their nation.
It has been quite some time now since Ethiopia declared a state of emergency to, quote, better secure the country. Life in Addis Ababa and other major cities remains normal.
We're going to school and everything is going peacefully, as we can see. And we didn't see anything new since the state of emergency. As I told you, everything is going well. Everything is going as normal and as before.
Since this state of emergency, we are better defending our country following the war waged against it. It's peaceful here, and we have continued supporting the government's effort at the war front. We consider this a necessary step for our security, and we have to prepare for anything needed to maintain our sovereignty.
As the war continues, the humanitarian situation in the north remains worrying. Humanitarian agencies have warned that this needs to be addressed as soon as possible to avoid any catastrophe. Meanwhile, the UN has released $40 million towards Ethiopia's humanitarian assistance efforts, part of which is meant for the northern region where conflict still rages on. Grumjara CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Germany is grappling with another wave of COVID-19 infections, reporting more than 52,000 new cases. Chancellor Angela Merkel described the situation as drastic on Wednesday, when almost 300 new deaths were reported. Health Minister Jens Spahn has called on doctors not to be too strict about waiting at least 6 months before giving patients vaccine booster shots. The rise in cases is affecting holiday events, with Munich the first major German city to cancel one of its most popular Christmas markets for the second year in a row. Well, several other European countries are also imposing measures to fight a new round of COVID-19 infections. Ireland is reintroducing restrictions as cases and hospitalizations rise nationwide. From Thursday, the country will require bars and nightclubs to close early, and it will ramp up the use of booster vaccines. People will be advised to work from home where possible. In Slovakia, the government is planning measures to limit access to services for unvaccinated people, as hospitals are getting overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients. The Czech Republic is also set to approve new restrictions. Authorities there will ban people who have not been vaccinated from access to public events and services from Monday. Well, that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching.
It's just taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
At least 15 people killed in Sudan as demonstrators clash with security forces in Khartoum. The U.S. Secretary of State calls for an end to hostilities in Ethiopia. And military chiefs meet in Côte d'Ivoire to discuss the tide of extremist violence in the Sahel region. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up on the program. In business, South Africa's inflation rate remains unchanged ahead of a key interest rate decision on Thursday. In sports, South Africa Director of Rugby, Rassie Erasmus, is handed a 2-month ban by World Rugby. Well, let's start the program in Sudan, where at least 15 people have been killed in anti-military protests. That's according to the Central Committee of Sudan Doctors. Now, reports say security forces opened fire on the protesters in the capital Khartoum and its twin city of Omdurman. Ahead of Wednesday demonstrations, authorities closed 4 out of the 10 bridges linking Khartoum with the cities of Bahri and Omdurman. The country has been experiencing a near total telecommunications blackout. The army chief, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, was sworn in last week as the head of a new transitional council that he appointed to lead the country. The military takeover has drawn international criticism. Pro-democracy groups have promised to continue protesting until the country returns to civilian rule.
The responsibility of the military is to maintain security. As for managing the state, it is for civilians, and the whole world is unanimous on that.
Well, let's go live now to Khartoum. Our correspondent, Naba Mohideen, is standing by with the latest. Naba, following a day of heavy protests on Wednesday, tell us what is the current situation there today?
Hi, yes, bridges are opened and many streets are opened, but life is not restored to normalcy. Yes, there is some businesses have resumed, like banks and some institutions, but still people are worried to go around and to go back to their normal life. There is some checkpoints in Bahri city is still in different places and different stations in Bahri city, which this city linking Khartoum, this bridge just behind me linking Khartoum to Bahri. There is like group medical groups are still counting the casualties and injuries. There is some reports saying that the death toll has risen to 17, not 15, and not confirmed numbers talking about 80 injured people. On ground also telecommunications are back, but internet is still slow, and the internet for consumers like mobile internet is not restored yet. Only the landline and phone calls and phone signals are restored. And there is also calls among professional unions to keep moving and organize more protests in the coming days till they see the civilian government is reinstated and Abdullah Hamdok is released.
Well, indeed, that call for a return to civilian rule is also being heard in the region by regional leaders as well as international partners that are concerned about the situation. Just give us an update now on efforts to end the current crisis in the country.
Actually, yes, there were some international and internal mediation efforts, but it seems like it reached a deadlock. Because the recent decisions by the military chiefs is so apparent that there is no breakthrough in the mediation efforts. The last effort was made by U.S. It was diplomatic efforts by U.S. to to urge the two parties to sit in tables again and to negotiate. And some officials, Sudanese officials and the military has promised that they will release Abdullah Hamdok and political detainees within 48 hours, but Hamdok and the other detainees are not released. So it seems like one of the parties is not clear that the mediation efforts can ever solve this political crisis. In the same time, there is escalation and there is clinging between, like the military is insisting on forming the government, and the political parties are insisting on not negotiating with the military, and Abdullah Hamdok has his conditions and the street has conditions also. So we probably will see more escalation and more fragile situation, and the crisis may get complications. It seems like mediation efforts didn't make any breakthrough, and it seems like the military generals will form the government soon, due to some sources told CGTN that the military will announce a prime minister within a day or two.
Well, thank you so much for that update. That's Nawa Muhyiddin live for us in Khartoum, Sudan. Now, the mass protests in Sudan come as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes his first visit to Africa. The Secretary of State has expressed concerns about democratic recession in Sudan, calling for the reinstatement of Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok. The PM is currently under house arrest in Khartoum.
And I'll say again about Prime Minister Hamdok, he is a source of legitimacy, and it's vital that the transition regain the legitimacy that it had before the civilian-led effort was derailed. But if the military puts this train back on its tracks and does what's necessary, I think the support that has been very strong from the international community can resume. That support has largely been suspended. People of Sudan have repeatedly made clear their aspirations for democracy, their aspirations for this transition to continue. So this is what they want. This is what the international community supports.
Well, indeed, Sudan's neighbors and other countries in the region are paying close attention to developments in the country. Let's cross now to Adel Al-Mahrawi in Cairo, Egypt, for more on these latest developments in Sudan. Adel, a delegation from the Arab League has called for talks to try and end this current stalemate. Do we know of any efforts by the regional organization to support or perhaps even mediate dialogue in Sudan?
The League of Arab States has showed great concern towards the recent developments in Sudan. The Arab League, as you said, sent a delegation led by the Deputy Secretary General, Ambassador Hussam Zaki, where he met Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of the military and the transition in Sudan as well. And the Arab League stressed that dialogue is key to get Sudan out of this political dilemma and make sure that progress and the aspirations of the people of Sudan are met. The reactions of the Arab world in general has been more or less vague towards Sudan. There hasn't been any clear-cut positions, as we've heard, for example, Antony Blinken saying and stressing support to Abdullah Hamdok, the exiled or the ousted prime minister. But on the other hand, Egyptian and the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the key Arab players in the region, and specifically Egypt, when it comes to Sudan, they showed concern, called for the tension to calm down. However, they have not shown great support, or at least naming Abdullah Hamdok as a solution for a way out. So for the Arab world in general, looking for a solution in general without specifying names is key.
Well, thank you so much for that update. That's Adel Al-Mahrawi live for us there in Cairo. Now, staying with the story, let's bring you some analysis. We're joined now by Amira Al-Said, a political analyst and writer and editor at the Egyptian Gazette. She's live with us from Cairo. Amira, thank you so much for your time. We are seeing, of course, that talks to try and resolve Sudan's political crisis are hitting a deadlock. Recent developments show that the military is essentially consolidating its grip on power, despite international pressure to return to civilian rule. In your view, Amira, what can be done to ensure the military, in fact, sticks to the plan to hand over to civilian leadership?
Since the 25th of October, Sudan has been plunged into like a whirlwind of political instability, and such instability reached its peak yesterday when 15 people lost their lives as the armed forces they used like force in order to oppress people who were talking to streets to express their anger against the military takeover. Despite the international condemnation, we have seen that Al-Burhan is moving ahead with his plan as if he is trying to impose the status quo. We have seen, for example, the U.S. State Secretary said from Kenya that there should be the political or there should be democratic handover for the rule in Sudan. We have seen also the Arab countries, they are trying to ease the tension. We have seen a vital role played by Saudi Arabia in the last period in order to find a way out of this crisis through dialogue. But what we have seen on the real ground that now Al-Burhan is moving ahead with a certain scenario. He formed a transitional sovereignty council. He wants to bring the civilians back, but according to his own scenario, there will be civilians according to this council, but the military will have an upper hand, and this definitely is refused by all the international community. So I think that there will be like more, we can say more strict actions in order to put an end to the bloodshed in Sudan.
And what might those strict actions or firmer actions from the international community look like? Are we going to see sanctions or perhaps anything more that can be done beyond these threats?
Definitely there should be sanctions. We have seen in the last period, for example, the World Bank, it suspended its aid to Sudan, though Sudan was struggling in order to find access to such billions of dollars. We have seen also the US froze like $700 million. But such sanctions, we have seen that the Sudanese people also, they are bearing a brunt of such economic sanctions, because now the Sudanese economy is in dire straits, and the hard, we can say the hard-won economic reform is now being hardest hit by such economic sanctions. There has been also a certain report that the Congress is mulling over a certain resolution to impose sanctions over army leaders in order to all those who were responsible for such oppressing demonstrators, they should be held accountable. So I think there should be more sanctions, but a sanction that did not harm the Sudanese people who were bearing the brunt of such economic and political instability. We have seen in the last period that Sudan was trying to be back on track in terms of economic stability, but now definitely the recent decisions by the World Bank or the United States, it has definitely a negative impact on the Sudanese economy. Maybe there will be more severe sanctions in the upcoming period for those who are responsible for this dilemma in Sudan.
Indeed, these sanctions are not without some unintended consequences. Thanks as always for your analysis. Amira Al-Sayed joining us there live from Cairo. Now, United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called for parties involved in the conflict in Ethiopia to hold talks and agree on a cessation of hostilities. He made the remarks while visiting Kenya on Wednesday, his first stop on a three-nation Africa tour. Blinken reiterated that there is still an opportunity to put an end to Ethiopia's year-long fallout. The unrest began in the northern Tigray region in November last year. It has since spilled over into neighboring Amhara and Afar as rebel forces march south, threatening to take the capital, Addis Ababa. The U.S. has advised its citizens in Ethiopia to leave the country as soon as possible.
The way the conflict has progressed, more and more parts of the country have become involved and or are in jeopardy with their citizens bearing the consequences. And whether that's in Tigray over the last year, more recently in Amara, and moving further south toward Addis, the people who suffer are the people. And we have to make sure that they are getting the assistance they need and that the fighting ceases and the talking starts. In addition to that, the conflict in Ethiopia is a threat to peace and security in the Horn of Africa. And that is of deep concern to us too, and it's of deep concern to our partners, including here in Kenya.
The United Nations says 10 of its local staff are still being held by security agencies in Ethiopia. The government says they are in custody for violating the recently imposed state of emergency and could be tried in a court of law once investigations are completed. A UN official on Monday said the government had freed 34 contract truck drivers supplying aid, but 36 are still being detained. As CGTN's Gurumchala reports, the war in northern Ethiopia continues despite international efforts to end it.
The United Nations continued calling on Ethiopian authorities to release its employees who are still being detained over what Addis Ababa said is a breach of the state of emergency rules. Authorities at the Foreign Ministry told us the federal police has already released most UN workers arrested after the investigation was completed. The case for the rest of the detained suspects is being handled by the security team formed under the state of emergency. Ethiopian officials have reiterated anyone either belonging to the UN or AU who breaks the nation's law will be held accountable. On the other hand, war continues in the north, especially in the Amhara and Afar regions. We have received reports from the government source that TPLF forces are losing strategic locations to the ENDF.
An organized militia, the youth of Amhara known as Fanos, the Oromo tribe militia and the brave National Defense Force, as well as our Air Force, are repelling the blindly marching rebel force. They have now started a strong offensive, finishing their defensive works. Due to that, the town of Kemise is under a roundup by our forces. This is because people have responded to the government's call to defend their nation.
It has been quite some time now since Ethiopia declared a state of emergency to, quote, better secure the country. Life in Addis Ababa and other major cities remains normal.
We're going to school and everything is going peacefully, as we can see. And we didn't see anything new since the state of emergency. As I told you, everything is going well. Everything is going as normal and as before.
Since this state of emergency, we are better defending our country following the war waged against it. It's peaceful here, and we have continued supporting the government's effort at the war front. We consider this a necessary step for our security, and we have to prepare for anything needed to maintain our sovereignty.
As the war continues, the humanitarian situation in the north remains worrying. Humanitarian agencies have warned that this needs to be addressed as soon as possible to avoid any catastrophe. Meanwhile, the UN has released $40 million towards Ethiopia's humanitarian assistance efforts, part of which is meant for the northern region where conflict still rages on. Gurumchala, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
You're watching Africa Live. Here's what's coming up after the break. Military chiefs meet in Côte d'Ivoire to discuss the tide of extremist violence in the Sahel region. And Germany on alert as COVID infections surge. Let's start in East Africa now, where ISIL has claimed responsibility for Tuesday's bombings in Uganda. According to authorities, the ISIL-affiliated group, the Allied Democratic Forces, were behind the suicide bombs that left 6 people dead and at least 30 injured. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has vowed to crush the ADF. CGTN's Michael Baleke has more from the capital, Kampala.
I feel like
hours after the bomb blast, Honest Kansime still feels upset by Tuesday's explosion. She was meters away from the central police station when the bomb went off.
So I was about to get out of the car to go and run some errands. And then that's when I heard the blast, like the sound. Maybe let me call it a sound, because by then I didn't know what it is. that horrible sound, and then like my car went up, and then went down.
Kansime says a big ball of smoke and fire engulfed the area. Many people were lying helpless on the ground. Many cars and buildings around her were shattered. She says she was lucky to escape, but has been left traumatized.
Honestly, I still feel some shaking. The shaking was more in the legs. Now I feel it more in the, I don't know how to explain it, more in the stomach, more inside, because I saw like blood, like there was a leg. I don't know if it belonged to any of those ladies or if it belonged to who. So seeing all that, I haven't picked courage to even eat anything.
Minutes later, another explosion went off near the Parliament building. Police say 6 people, including 3 suicide bombers, died on spot in both attacks, and more than 30 people were injured. The latest attacks come 22 days after an explosion happened at this bar and restaurant a few minutes outside the capital. A waitress died, and 2 days later another suspected suicide bomber blew himself up in a bus carrying passengers to western Uganda. The UK government had issued a terror alert just days earlier. Police in Uganda blamed the attacks on domestic terror groups of the ADF rebel outfit linked to the Islamic State. Police investigations show the terrorists are hitting soft targets with bombs built from common household items.
We indicated some of these items like nails, metal scrap, ball bearings. They use phones and batteries, as well as ammonium nitrogen.
Security analysts are worried that compared to previous attacks carried out by foreign nationals, the current attacks are being carried out by Ugandans.
What we are seeing now are the results of ISIS in allocation. They indoctrinated, they changed the minds of so many youths and so many people, which they can possibly do here, that by the time you realize it is your son being a terrorist, it is your wife becoming a terrorist, it is your grandchild, or even the best of your friends.
But Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has vowed to work with his neighbors to hunt down the extremist groups. He says joint police and military operations have so far killed 7 suspected terrorists, and 81 people have been arrested in connection with the attacks. Michael Baleke, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to visit Nigeria today on his second stop of his first Africa tour since taking office. Blinken's first stop was Kenya on Wednesday. His visit to Nigeria comes after the United States removed Nigeria from its list of countries with religious freedom concerns. On his trip to Nigeria, Blinken will meet with President Muhammadu Buhari. The trip comes at a time when insurgency, characterized by killings and kidnappings, is escalating in the country's north. Blinken is also expected to speak on the U.S.-Africa policy ahead of his trip to Senegal. Now, the death toll from Sunday's attack on a gendarmerie post in Burkina Faso has risen to 53. This, according to officials. 49 police officers and 4 civilians are among those killed. The attack took place near a gold mine in Inata in the northern Saoum region.
Je voudrais par ailleurs et surtout
I would like to present my condolences as well as the governments to all the families affected by this tragedy. I also wish quick recovery to the injured. Already, we have taken a number of measures, and I say and repeat that after the investigation, all the people who are found to be involved in these events concerning Inata will be disciplined without exception. I repeat, without exception.
Des sanctions disciplinaires.
Now, the attack in Burkina Faso brings, in fact, to 85 the total number of people killed in the Sahel region in just 1 week. and that has raised concerns over the deteriorating security situation there. In Niger, gunmen killed 25 people in the southwest along the country's border with Mali. And on Tuesday, attackers on motorcycles stormed the camp of a local self-defense militia near the village of Bakorat in the Tahua region. In Burkina Faso, 7 police officers were killed on Sunday in an attack also near the border with Mali. Now, attackers in the tri-border area are often blamed on insurgent groups affiliated with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. The attacks come as West African military chiefs are due to meet in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, to discuss the rising tide of extremist violence in the Sahel region. The 3-day summit will assess current operations and reflect on the prospects for improving security in the ECOWAS zone. Well, joining us now to discuss this further is Fariman Rodriguez Kone, a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you so much for your time. To begin with, why is the war against terrorism in Mali and the larger Sahel seemingly going so badly?
Well, Sahelan countries are not quick, were not quick to understand that jihadists raises on state abstinence and on unsecure borders area and social vulnerabilities, which facilitate local recruitment of jihadist militants and to impose the dictat. And also the insurrection become endogenous, and it's now difficult to fight it by military response. The group are also more and more sophisticated and they are operating with special method of harassment, complex attacks.
And for Hiraman, are these attacks at all linked to, well, rather the increase in attacks, is this at all linked to the withdrawal of French troops in Mali?
First, it is not a total withdrawal. It's not a total withdrawal, but rather a tactical and operational reconfiguration of French troops. It is difficult, however, to say that the current increase situation is only due to the reconfiguration of French troops. Certainly, the massive presence of French troops was dissuasive, but we must also acknowledge that despite this massive presence, it had not at all stopped the worsening trend of attacks since 2015. Jihadist groups are more and more community-based and resilient. They are more and more controlling all kinds of traffic, which reinforce their financial and operational capacities. And finally, they are progressing in a context where Sahel states are more and more absent in terms of development, delivery, and also in a political crisis context.
Well, for Hiraman Kone, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, joining us there via Zoom. He is a security analyst with the ISS. Now let's turn to the coronavirus pandemic. Germany is grappling with another wave of COVID-19 infections, reporting more than 52,000 new cases. Chancellor Angela Merkel described the situation as drastic on Wednesday, when almost 300 new deaths were reported. Health Minister Jens Spahn has called on doctors not to be too strict about waiting at least 6 months before giving patients vaccine booster shots. The rise in cases is affecting holiday events, with Munich, the first major German city, to cancel one of its most popular Christmas markets for the second year in a row. Indeed, several other European countries are imposing measures to fight a new round of COVID-19 infections. Ireland is reintroducing restrictions as cases and hospitalizations rise nationwide. From Thursday, the country will require bars and nightclubs to close early, and it will ramp up the use of booster vaccines. People will be advised to work from home where possible. In Slovakia, the government is planning measures to limit access to services for unvaccinated people, as hospitals are getting overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients. The Czech Republic is also set to approve new restrictions. Authorities there will ban people who've not been vaccinated from access to public events and services from Monday. Your business news coming up next. South Africa's inflation rate remains unchanged ahead of a key interest rate decision on Thursday. And traders in Ghana call for tax relief amid a rise in cost of living after headline inflation rose to a 15-month high. Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climate and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories. Let's have a look. We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice. South Africa's inflation rate remained unchanged on the eve of a central bank interest rate announcement that's dividing economists and traders. Consumer prices rose 5% from a year earlier in October, the same as the previous month. Statistics South Africa said Wednesday in a statement published on its website, headline inflation driven by rising food costs and record high fuel prices has now breached 4.5%, the midpoint of the central bank's target range at which it prefers to anchor expectations for 6 consecutive months. That, coupled with warnings about upside risks to the inflation outlook, could prompt the South African Reserve Bank to lift the benchmark interest rate on Thursday and signal a more aggressive tightening cycle. The implied policy rate path of the central bank's quarterly projection model, which it uses as a guide, indicates a 25 basis point increase in the final quarter of this year and in every quarter of 2022 and 2023. Now, the International Monetary Fund said Tuesday that it was unable to offer any financial support to Zimbabwe due to its unsustainable debt and outstanding arrears. The Washington-based lender said after a month-long mission to the Southern African nation that obtaining a financial arrangement would require a clear path to comprehensive restructuring of Zimbabwe's external debt. This includes the clearance of arrears and obtaining financial assurances from creditors. Zimbabwe, which has suffered from bouts of hyperinflation in the last 15 years, has not received funding from lenders like the IMF and the World Bank for more than 2 decades. The country has more than $10 billion of debt, most of which is in arrears. Well, Kenya is set to take up a 5th sovereign bond targeting close to $1 billion in the next fiscal year, with the National Treasury also leaning towards issuing its first green bond. The government has in the last 7 years issued 4 Eurobonds, netting a total of $7.85 billion. The National Treasury confirmed in its draft 2022 budget policy statement that it intends to tap into green financing in the upcoming fiscal year. It adds that it's targeting funds as part of the net external budget deficit financing amounting to $3.2 billion in the 2022-23 fiscal year. Now, despite being an oil and gas exporter, Ghana is battling rising inflation. Supply chain disruptions have led to a surge in retail fuel prices, driving headline inflation to a 15-month high of 11% in October. As CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports, traders in the West African nation are now calling for tax cuts to help their businesses stay afloat.
Sadia Umaru is having a slow business day in this market in Accra. She says people are not buying her grains.
When I tell people the price of the grains, they complain it is too expensive. I sit here all day and hardly make any sales.
Sadia says she's had to increase the price of the grains 5 times this year. It's because the cost of transporting the food to the market has gone up due to hikes in fuel prices. So she passes the extra cost to consumers.
I buy the grains from northern Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso and other neighboring countries. and I pay a lot of money to transport the goods to Accra. I barely make profits when I sell the grains.
Fuel prices have gone up 9 times this year in Ghana. The increases in fuel prices are mainly linked to changes on global markets.
But it is already feeding through to inflation in other sectors of Ghana's economy. The cost of goods and services have shot up to 11% in October from 10.6% in September.
The government has scrapped some taxes on petroleum products to cushion consumers. It has removed the price stabilization and recovery levy of 16 pesos per litre of petrol and 14 pesos per litre of diesel. But analysts want the government to be more realistic about how it manages the economy.
Make sure whatever you are going to project, you can easily spend to meet that. It's as simple as that. And the people will believe you. But then if you read a budget and you raise the people's hope as if, there's future for petroleum prices, there's future for giving them roads and all those. Meanwhile, the thing is not there. If government takes off taxes, it's going to be suicidal. That's why I said the government needs to come out clear and tell the people that this is the situation we are faced with. And we have to take the pain now for a good future.
Still, Sadia Umaru wants more taxes on fuel to be cut. She believes her business will only bounce back when she is able to reduce the prices of her grains when she pays less to transport the food. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Your sports news up next on Africa Live. Coming up, South African Director of Rugby, Rassie Erasmus, is handed a 2-month ban by World Rugby.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born